coming along today. I know everybody's really busy, so I appreciate your time. This is only kind of a bite-sized introduction to trauma-informed practice, so we're probably only going to be about 15 to 20 minutes. So my name's Gemma White. I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker for 20 years now. I'm currently working as practice lead for Herefordshire Adult Social Care, but my background, I worked in mental health for many years. I was an approved mental health professional and best interest assessor. I've also worked in locality teams and also more recently been seconded to research projects. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all about trauma-informed practice. By the end of today, I want you to have an understanding of the definition of trauma. We're going to talk a little bit about how people respond to trauma, because it's important that you understand that. And then we're going to think about what are the core principles of trauma-informed practice and how you can apply those to your roles. So what is trauma then? Trauma can be an event or a series of events which is experienced by someone as harmful or life-threatening. So I think if we unpick that a little bit, so trauma can result from a one-off. It can result from an accident, a car crash, a medical emergency, falling off a cliff, or it could be a natural disaster, but it can also be a complex trauma, which is where people have kind of repeated exposure to traumatic experiences over and over. And this kind of complex trauma occurs within relationships. So things like being a victim of domestic abuse can result in complex trauma. Being neglected or abused as a child can result in complex trauma. Emotional abuse, witnessing abuse can result in trauma. And I think the other really important thing to be mindful of is that, it's about the individual and whether they experience the trauma as harmful or life-threatening. And we're all so different and all have different resources, different strengths, different circumstances that what I perceive as harmful can be very different to what someone else perceives. So it is really individual. And trauma can cause, long-lasting effects, and it can affect all aspects of our well-being. So, it can affect our mental health, our physical health, and it can particularly affect our relationships and how we relate to other people. So I guess the main takeaway from this is that, it is really individual, and there's not a kind of one size fits all, really. So if that's what trauma is, what is trauma-informed practice? And I guess the thing to be really clear about is that, trauma-informed practice is not about treating the trauma. It's not about healing the trauma, unless that's our, we work, perhaps in psychology, and that's our direct role. But working in a trauma-informed way means that we, identify and work towards reducing the barriers that people can experience when they're accessing our services if they're coming from a history of trauma, particularly that complex trauma. So trauma-informed practice kind of involves realizing, sorry, every time someone comes in, it comes up over my slide and it distracts me. So trauma-informed practice means, that we take steps to come along to sessions like this and to have an understanding of the impact of trauma on people and think a little bit about the prevalence, that definition, complex trauma and kind of the more kind of simple trauma, which are kind of one-off events, that affects, hundreds of thousands of people. it's about recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. So it's about developing an understanding of what trauma can look like in people's behavior, how it can affect them and how it can affect how they relate to other people. And we're going to be talking a bit about that. And then it's about responding to all of that new knowledge, and integrating it into how we work with people, but also how our organisations work with people and how our organisations work with this. With us, it's trauma-informed practice recognises that that staff are an important resource, and organisations and managers need to work with their staff in a way that is mindful of staff's trauma as well. And lastly, it's about resisting re-traumatization by creating safe environments for the people who we work with. So yes, I guess the key takeaway is, it's about recognizing that people experience trauma, and that will affect how they relate to us and our services, and taking steps to try and reduce the impact of that so that people can engage with our services. So, how does trauma affect us? These are some of the feelings that people who've been through trauma can experience. People can feel very angry. They can feel scared or panicked. They can feel worried, irritable. Or on the other hand, people can feel very numb and not have any strong feelings. People can kind of connected to that, I guess. People can feel very unsure of what they want or what they need or what might help them. And when people have been through trauma, they often develop hypervigilance, which is when you're kind of very aware and alert of your surroundings and primed to something bad that might happen. And people can often feel a lot of self-blame and shame around trauma. They can feel that, perhaps they were behind the thing that happened to them, or they can feel that they should be able to just get over it. And that can be really a really powerful block to engaging in services. And the impact of those kind of feelings is that you can you can struggle to look after yourself. You can struggle to eat properly. You can struggle to keep on top of your personal hygiene. It might affect your job. It affects how you trust others. It affects your friendships, your relationships with colleagues, friends, family. It can affect people's memory, and people can have struggle to remember things. People can struggle to make decisions, and it can affect, people's hobbies, their leisure time, their sex life, and it can affect how people cope with change as well. So again, just remembering that all of these things are very individual, and people may experience some of these things, people may experience all of these things, but this is the range of things that people can experience when they've experienced trauma. So when people have experienced trauma, that can then affect how we respond to perceived threats. And I'm being very kind of emphasizing the word perceived there. There might not be an actual threat to us, but because we've been through a trauma, our nervous system is heightened, it's on high alert, and we can be overly kind of scanning the horizon for danger, and then respond in a way that's coming from that original trauma. And we can respond through 4 different ways. We can fight, we can flight, we can freeze, or we can fawn. And this kind of becomes our default way of coping with perceived threats, even though the original danger might have long passed. So we're going to think a little bit about what those 4 responses are. So the first one is fight. this is where someone responds to a perceived threat kind of aggressively, you know, with a kind of explosive temper. People who respond in this way kind of often feel they need to have the final say. They might be a lot of kind of talking back, and sometimes, generally, people can feel quite remorseful afterwards once their nervous system has had a chance to settle. So, for example, we might see this when we're working with someone and we're not able to, say, for example, they're running late and then we're not able to see them at that time. They may respond, you know, by shouting at us about that. And, you know, I want to be clear, you know, we're not here to be shouted at or abused in any way when we're doing our jobs, but it's just about taking a step back and trying to understand, you know, why has that person responded like that? Do we know that they've got, you know, a history of complex trauma? Could that be underlying that behaviour, that response to us? And then people can respond by flight. So this is where people kind of, avoid any perceived danger by removing themselves from it. So this, people might end relationships very abruptly. People might keep themselves very busy, avoid any downtime to really to avoid that situation. And people who have a flight response are often very anxious, experience high levels of anxiety. So, you know, if we're working with someone and they're just not engaging with us, you know, that might be, you know, a trauma response, and we need to think about that. And later on in the presentation, when we go through the core principles of trauma-informed practice, we'll think about some ways to support people to engage in our services who are having these 4 trauma responses. So the third trauma response is that people can freeze. So when they're faced with a perceived threat or a perceived danger, they can just shut down. So that might be, you know, literally hiding from the world, hiding from everybody, not engaging. It might be procrastinating, you know, people feeling really unable to make a decision. And I guess we might see that if we're working with someone who just seems really reluctant to make changes. You know, we might want to step back and have a think about why that might be. And then the fourth response is fawning. So this is where people, you know, kind of desperately just trying to please the people around them to avoid any conflict, to avoid any perceived danger. So again, you know, we might see this particularly in people who are victims of domestic abuse. And when we're working with people, I can think of a few people who I've worked with who, you know, have that history of complex trauma, and they might be agreeing with all the goals that we're setting, but then they don't actually seem invested in it, and, you know, are finding it very difficult to take those first steps to change. You know, that might be indicative of someone, you know, taking a fawn approach. So that's the 4 ways that people can respond to perceived threats or perceived danger. So yeah, let's think about, well, what is trauma-informed practice then? How can we respond to all of this? So there are 5 principles of trauma-informed practice: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. So safety is about the physical, you know, creating environments that are physically and emotionally safe for all, for the people who we're working with and for us as staffs. It's about trustworthiness. So again, it's about us and the organisations that we work for having clear, consistent boundaries and being transparent in our decision making. It's about choice. It's about giving people options and talking those options through. And then once we've done that, it's about working in collaboration. So it's about sharing decision making and often peer support can come under this this heading. And then it's about empowerment, so building people's strengths and resilience to make changes, to be able to engage with services. So let's think about those in a little bit more detail. So the first one is safety. So this is about organisations prioritising the emotional and physical safety of staff and service users. Until everybody feels safe, we can't self-actualize. We need all of our basic needs met, and safety is one of those, before we can grow, before we can change, before we can develop. And recognizing people's perspectives and validating their feelings can be is the first step of that. So we might not agree with the people who we're working with. We might have a different perspective, but we can still recognize theirs and validate their feelings. So that's the first top tip for working in a trauma-informed way. Trustworthiness. This is essentially about doing what it says on the tin. It's about explaining what we're doing and why, and then doing it. And if we can't do it for any reason, or if we're going to be late, being transparent about that. And that consistency and being predictable can help reduce anxiety and build trust and relationships with people. So yeah, trustworthiness, doing what it says on the tin. The third principle is choice. So yeah, it's about shared decision making. It's about talking to the people who we're working with and making sure they understand what their options are, and listening to their needs and wishes, and then setting goals to move forward. And this kind of choice can often help reduce power imbalances that do exist between professionals and the people who we're working with. Okay, the fourth one is collaboration. So that's about working with people, doing things with them rather than doing things to them. This is where kind of peer support networks can be really useful. And it's also about recognizing that we're part of organizations, we're part of these relationships, and caring for ourselves and our colleagues, as well as the people who we're working with. Okay, the final one is empowerment. So this is staff and the people who we're working with feeling like they're listened to. It's about having, everyone's feelings and concerns are validated, and then focusing on what we can do, but also leaving room for those difficulties to be explored and thinking about, well, how can we overcome some of those difficulties. And I think just a really kind of explicit acknowledgement that people who have experienced trauma, are deeply affected by it, and that will impact on how they access services. So yeah, that's the fifth principle, empowerment. The other thing to be mindful of is cultural considerations. So, we also need to be asking people about how their experiences, how their cultural values, how their beliefs might influence their experience of contact with services, because that people's cultural backgrounds can also result in trauma. People who have people who experience racism, that will impact how they access services. And I just kind of wanted to highlight the social graces model. This is a diagram of it. And this was developed by someone called John Burnham, and it kind of represents all the differences in beliefs and lifestyles and culture that exist between all of us. And some of these are very, visible. And some of these things, we can't see. We have to talk to people about them and find out. And it's just a really nice model to kind of reflect on our own biases and think about how our own identity may impact on our thinking and on our behaviour, and how that then impacts on the people who we might be working with. So yeah, we need to think about how culture can affect people's experiences of accessing services. So that was a kind of very brief introduction to trauma-informed practice. The key takeaway really is that, trauma-informed practice is about, trying to reduce the barriers to our services that people affected by trauma can experience. So, we're not expected to be therapists, but it's about recognizing that people can only engage with services and make changes when they feel safe. So, and we can make people feel a bit safer by using the 5 principles of trauma-informed practice, which is about safety, recognizing and validating people's feelings. It's about trustworthiness, doing what we say on the tin. It's about choice. So explaining choices clearly to people and having clear goals. Setting clear goals with them. It's about collaboration. So it's about doing things with people, not doing things to people. And it's about empowerment. So it's about focusing on what people can do whilst also acknowledging people's difficulties and struggles. So that is the end. There are a couple of other resources there for you to have a look at. There's a TEDx talk there, which I really like, and a research in practice briefing. And this is the QR code for the feedback form, and we're going to put the feedback link in the comments now. And I think we can stop the recording, and I'll take any questions or any comments. Thanks, Angela.